Tonight on Fear Nox, we're rolling sound in places the public hasn't walked in years. Dead fountains filmed in the glow of exit signs. Service corridors fixed at 68 degrees long after the tenants left. And back rooms where clocks still hum without hands. 10 first-hand accounts from inspectors, EMTs, night maintenance, and urban explorers trace what waits inside abandoned malls. Records pulled from incident reports, body mics, and handhelds that should have drained hours earlier. No spoilers. You'll hear air handlers turning against power logs, delivery tunnels that double back, and footsteps recorded by cameras facing empty concourses. Subscribe and hit the bell. If you've worked retail after hours, you'll recognize the sound the building makes when it thinks no one's listening. Drop your own story in the comments. We read them all. New cases every week. All right, lights to battery. Let's go in. My name is Mark Jensen, and I've been an EMT for 12 years, all of them here in Northwood. Most of my calls are pretty standard. Falls, chest pains, car accidents. I've seen my share of trauma, but you learn to compartmentalize. You rely on your training, your protocols, and your partner. That's what keeps you grounded. It was 3:15 a.m. when the call came in. Dispatch flagged it as a 911 hang-up, silent line, but with faint, ambient noise in the background. Location: an old boutique on Elm Street, vacant for at least 2 years. The place used to be called Chic and Unique. My partner, Ben Carter, was driving. Officer Ramirez was already on scene when we pulled up, his cruiser's alley lights painting the brick facade in slow, pulsing red and blue. "Anything, officer?" Ben asked, grabbing the jump bag from the rig. Ramirez shook his head. Side door was unsecured. No signs of forced entry, but it's definitely not locked. Place looks undisturbed from the outside, but I haven't gone in. Just a welfare check. But a silent 911 from an empty building feels off. "Understood," I said, clipping my body mic to my vest. "We'll do a quick sweep. You want to follow us in, officer?" "Give you some space for now," Ramirez replied. "I'll secure the perimeter out here. Call if you find anything." Ben and I exchanged a glance. Standard procedure for a potential person in distress call in an unsecured building was to wait for law enforcement to clear it. But the dispatcher had emphasized the faint ambient noise and the possibility of someone needing help. We decided to proceed cautiously, maintaining comms with Ramirez and dispatch. We always operate on the assumption that every second counts. We pushed the side door open. It scraped against the concrete, a sound that echoed unnaturally in the stillness. Inside, the air was cold and stale, thick with the scent of dust and something vaguely floral, like old dried potpourri. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing the main retail floor. Dust motes danced in the light, thick as snow. And then we saw them. Arranged in a wide semicircle, facing the dressing rooms at the back of the store, were at least a dozen mannequins. They stood perfectly upright, some still wearing tattered, outdated clothing, others bare. Their blank faces were all directed towards the back wall, towards the dark corridor leading to the changing rooms. It was like they were an audience waiting for a show. I remembered seeing a similar display once in a museum, for an exhibit on fashion history. I'd taken my daughter Clara, and she'd been fascinated by the rigid poses. "Well, that's not normal," Ben muttered, his voice low. "Negative," I confirmed. "Looks like someone's been busy." We began our sweep, flashlights cutting arcs through the gloom. The mannequins were creepy, but not immediately threatening. Just out of place. We moved slowly, checking behind display racks, under the dusty counters. There was no sign of anyone. My breath plumed in the cold air. Then, a faint sound registered on my body mic, picked up by the sensitive omnidirectional unit. It was a rhythmic, almost mechanical voice. 1, 2. It was low, steady, and repetitive. 1, 2. I paused, raising a hand. Ben, you hear that? Ben tapped his ear. Yeah, sounds like it's coming from the back, behind the dressing rooms. Dispatch, this is Med 2. We're picking up a low, repetitive sound, possibly a voice, from the rear of the structure. Moving to investigate. Med 2, copy. Proceed with caution. Dispatch's voice crackled. My initial thought was a recording, maybe a forgotten speaker system or kids messing around. But the cadence was too even, too deliberate. We moved towards the dressing room corridor, our boots crunching on loose plaster and dust. The sound grew clearer with every step, a monotonous count. 1, 2. The corridor was narrow, lined with empty changing stalls. Some of the doors hung ajar, revealing bare, dusty interiors. The air here was even colder. The sound was definitely coming from the very back, where a single unmarked door likely led to a stockroom or office. I made a mental note to check my mic gain later. The sound seemed to be louder on my headset than it felt in the air around me. A small, almost imperceptible misjudgment in the moment, focusing on the source rather than the input. We reached the door. It was slightly ajar. Ben pushed it open with his foot, his flashlight beam piercing the darkness. The room was a small stock back room, filled with empty shelving units and a few overturned cardboard boxes. No windows, no obvious vents, and no one. The counting, however, was still there. 1, 2. It filled the small room, emanating from nowhere. The sound was clear on our mics, but standing there, in the center of the room, my ears registered only silence. A profound, unnerving silence that swallowed the sound the moment it left the headset. I felt a prickle of unease. My comms with dispatch had gone silent too, the signal apparently dropping out the moment we entered the back room. Our primary communication protocol had failed. Ben, do you hear that with your ears or just on the mic? I whispered. He shook his head, his face pale in the beam of his light. Just the mic. The room's dead silent otherwise. We swept our lights across the floor, searching for a speaker, a phone, anything. And that's when I saw it. On the concrete floor, beneath a collapsed shelf, was a thin, even layer of what looked like white talcum powder. And in the talc, a single, distinct footprint. It was a bare foot pointing inward towards the back wall. The toes were clearly defined, the arch, the heel. But the track stopped abruptly. The talc ended in a clean line, revealing bare concrete beyond. There was no exit track, no other footprints, just that single, perfectly preserved impression, leading into the talc. And then, nothing. It was as if whatever made the print had simply ceased to exist at that exact spot, or ascended, or vanished. The counting continued in my ear, a steady, rhythmic 1, 2. It felt colder in the room, despite the lack of a breeze. My skin crawled. We were trained to look for logical explanations, for medical emergencies, for human threats. This was none of those. This was a contradiction, a physical impossibility staring us in the face. The mannequins, the counting, the footprint. It was a perfectly constructed lure. But for what? "We need to back out," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Now." We retreated, our flashlights sweeping the empty room one last time. The counting continued on our body mic recordings, even as the room itself remained silent. The single footprint frozen in the talc, pointing into an impossible void. We called Officer Ramirez, our voices tight, the story of what we'd found sounding absurd even to our own ears. He arrived with backup, but a full sweep revealed nothing more. No one was found, no source for the sound. The footprint remained, a stark, inexplicable anomaly on the dusty concrete. And on the recording, the counting continued, a steady, hypnotic pulse. 1, 2, 1, 2. My name is Arthur Hayes, and I've been an electrical inspector for 15 years. Most of my work involves new commercial builds, but a good portion of my time is spent on decommissioning projects, making sure old buildings are safely powered down before demolition or major renovation. It's methodical work, mostly checking logs against physical installations, verifying lockout-tagout procedures, and ensuring no live circuits are left exposed. My toolkit is standard: multimeter, clamp meter, thermal imager, and a body camera for documentation. This particular job was an old Sears anchor store, part of a sprawling, half-abandoned mall scheduled for a complete overhaul. The contract specified a full power-down verification. I arrived at 0800 on a Tuesday, the air still damp and cool from an overnight rain. The mall's main power was already shut off at the utility feed, so my task was to confirm all internal panels within the Sears space were isolated and dead. I started in the main electrical room, a cavernous space behind the old customer service desk, filled with industrial gray cabinets. The room smelled faintly of ozone and old dust, a familiar scent. I methodically checked each main breaker, confirming their off positions, then used my multimeter to verify zero voltage at the terminals. Each step was recorded by my body camera, time-stamped. Breakers tagged, mains secured. Standard procedure. My core protocol is simple. Dead means dead. If a breaker is off and my meter confirms zero voltage, that circuit is inert. It's fundamental safety. You don't work on a circuit you think is off. You work on a circuit you've verified is off. By 11:30, I'd gone through 3/4 of the store's sub-panels. Everything was checking out. I moved into what used to be the women's apparel section, a vast, open space now stripped of fixtures, just bare concrete floors and exposed ceiling grids. My job here was to visually confirm all lighting was off, and then perform spot checks with the clamp meter on random fixture feeds to ensure no residual voltage. As I walked down the main aisle, my boots echoing, I noticed it. High above, 3 rows of ceiling troughers, maybe 20 fixtures in total, were flickering. Not randomly, but in a slow, synchronized pulse. Barely perceptible, like weak heartbeats. I stopped, pulled out my rangefinder. Roughly 150 feet down the aisle. I zoomed my camera in. Definitely flickering. I double-checked my internal map, cross-referencing it with the panel schedule. This particular section, Apparel A, was fed by Panel 3, Breaker 17. I had personally verified Panel 3 was dead, and Breaker 17 was off, maybe an hour ago. I walked back to the main panel room. My camera was still running. I went directly to Panel 3. Breaker 17 was clearly in the off position. I filmed it, zoomed in on the label in the switch. Then, I clipped my clamp meter onto the feed line for Breaker 17. The display read 0.00A, as expected. I stepped back, adjusting my camera. The moment I was about 3 feet away from the panel, the clamp meter, still clipped to the wire, emitted a low, steady buzz. I looked down. The display now read 0.25A. I stepped forward, and it immediately went back to 0.00A, silent. I tried it again. Step back, buzz, 0.25A. Step forward, silence, 0.00A. This wasn't right. A dead circuit shouldn't be drawing anything, let alone responding to my proximity. I pulled out my multimeter and tested the terminals of Breaker 17 directly. Solid 0.00V. I checked the bus bars for Panel 3 again. All dead. I even checked the main lugs feeding Panel 3 from the store's primary distribution. Dead. I walked back to the apparel aisle. The lights were still flickering, that slow, rhythmic pulse. I climbed a portable ladder I kept in my truck, reached up to one of the fixtures. I used my non-contact voltage detector. It lit up solid red, screaming. I connected my clamp meter directly to the fixture's hot wire. 0.25 amp. Steady. I pulled out my wattage calculator. That's a clean 60 watts per fixture, just as the original plans indicated. I called my supervisor, Brenda Chen. Brenda, I've got a situation at the old Sears. Panel 3, Apparel A circuit. Breaker 17 is off, verified dead at the panel, but the lights are flickering, drawing current. Arthur, you sure you're on the right circuit? Any cross feeds? Her voice was calm, procedural. Positive. I've re-verified Panel 3's mains, the breaker, and the fixture itself. Clamp meter reads 0 at the panel when I'm close, but buzzes and shows current when I step away. At the fixture, it's a steady 0.25 amps. Okay, secure the area. Don't touch anything live. Re-verify all upstream sources. Check for any rogue generators or solar arrays on the roof. Log everything. I told her I would. The air in the store, usually just stale and dusty, now carried a faint, almost sweet metallic tang. It reminded me of when I was a kid, visiting the mall with my parents, and the smell of the arcade mixed with the Cinnabon stand. I spent the next hour meticulously rechecking every panel, every subfeed, every junction box I could access. Nothing. All dead, all locked out. I even went up to the roof hatch, expecting to find a hidden generator or a forgotten solar panel array. The roof was clear, just gravel and tar, baking under the afternoon sun. I pulled out my thermal imager, scanning the ceiling tiles in the apparel section, looking for any heat signatures that might indicate an active transformer or a hidden power source. Nothing. just the ambient temperature of the building. My eyes were starting to feel gritty. I'd been on site since early morning, and the relentless focus was wearing me down. At one point, checking a completely unrelated dead circuit in panel 2, my multimeter briefly displayed 0.03 volt. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and reread it. 0. Just fatigue playing tricks on me. The flickering lights pulsed on. It wasn't random. It was a slow, deliberate rhythm, almost like a breath. My standard protocol for phantom voltage or induced current is to isolate the circuit and trace it back. But this wasn't phantom voltage. This was a sustained, measurable load. My usual next step would be to disconnect the fixture directly. But with an unknown live source, that was a major safety violation. I couldn't de-energize something that was already de-energized at the panel. The core procedure, disconnect at the source, was impossible because the source was a paradox. I couldn't use my tone generator to trace the lines because the lines were live. The entire safety protocol I relied on was failing. I remembered bringing my daughter, Lily, here years ago for Christmas shopping. She'd loved the bright, festive lights in this very aisle, pointing at them with such excitement. Now, they were dim, inexplicable, and unsettling. Back in the apparel aisle, I filmed the flickering lights again. The pulse seemed to have sped up slightly. Then, I went back to panel 3. I filmed breaker 17, clearly in the off position. I clipped my clamp meter onto the feed line. It read 0.00A. I stepped back, holding the camera steady. The meter buzzed, and the display flickered between 0.00A and 0.25A, settling on 0.25A for a full 5 seconds, then dropping back to 0.00A. I watched the video playback on my camera's small screen. It had captured the buzzing, but the reading was too small to be clear. As I watched, the lights in the apparel aisle, visible through the open doorway, suddenly brightened. Not a flicker, but a steady, full-power illumination. For a full minute, the aisle was lit as if the store was open for business. My non-contact voltage detector in my pocket began to shriek, even though I was in the panel room, 50 feet away. Then, just as suddenly, they dimmed back to their original, slow, rhythmic flicker. There had been no click from the breaker, no sound from the panel. I secured panel 3, double-locking the door and placing a bright orange "Do Not Enter" hazard sign across the frame. I left the clamp meter on the feed line, still reading 0.00A. I knew the video would show the breaker off, the lights flickering, and my meter reading 0 when I was near. It wouldn't fully capture the buzzing when I stepped away, or the momentary spikes, or the sudden brightening of the lights. How do you explain a power source that only manifests when you're not directly observing it? My name is Frank Miller. I've been in building security for 22 years, the last 10 as a night supervisor here at the Grand Atrium Complex. Most of that time is spent walking rounds, monitoring camera feeds, and managing access. It's a quiet job mostly. You learn the rhythm of a building after a decade, the hum of the HVAC, the faint creaks as the structure settles, the precise schedule of every automated system. You get used to the quiet. Part of that schedule involves the grand fountain in the central atrium. It's a decorative piece mostly, a tiered marble structure surrounded by polished tile. Every night at 11 p.m., per protocol, the pumps shut down, and the basin drains completely. The water is recycled, and the basin is left bone dry until 6 a.m., when the filtration cycle begins again. This is standard procedure, logged daily, confirmed by visual checks and system readouts. It's an energy saver, and it allows the maintenance crew to do their quarterly scrub down without affecting daytime operations. On Tuesday, October 17th, at 1:58 a.m., I was at my console in the security office, running through the perimeter checks. My shift had started at 10 p.m., and the building was locked down. I'd walked the main floors earlier, noting the faint, sweet scent of the floor wax from the day crew's final pass. Everything was normal. I cycled through the atrium cameras. Camera 3, mounted high on the mezzanine, offered a wide shot of the fountain court. The basin was, as expected, a pale, bone-white expanse of marble. No water, no moisture, just the dry, reflective surface of the polished stone. I made a mental note to log it as clear, then moved on to the loading docks. 2 minutes later, at precisely 2 a.m., the motion sensor in the atrium triggered. I glanced back at camera 3. Nothing. No person. No animal. Just the fountain, still dry. But then I saw it. A ripple, not a ripple of water, but a ripple on the surface of the dry basin. It was a reflection, shimmering and moving, perfectly mimicking the disturbance of water. Yet there was no water to disturb. The tiles around the dry basin, which should have been reflecting the static overhead lights, now showed distorted, wavering images, as if viewed through a liquid surface. My first thought was a camera glitch. Happens all the time. A stray signal, a faulty pixel. I rubbed my eyes, a small indulgence of fatigue. But the ripple persisted, expanding and contracting with an uncanny regularity. It wasn't a static image. It was dynamic. And it was originating from a bone-dry basin. I logged the anomaly at 2:01 and called down to Officer Davis, who was on his patrol route in the East Wing. Davis, head to the atrium fountain, camera 3. Visual check. Report anything unusual. Copy that, Frank. On my way. His voice crackled briefly over the radio. While Davis was en route, I pulled up the schematics for the fountain's plumbing and pump system. There were no secondary water lines, no emergency fill valves that could activate without a manual override or a system command from the control room. I checked the system logs. All systems offline, drains open, no water flow registered. Davis's voice came back at 2:06. Frank, I'm at the fountain. Basin is dry, no water, nothing unusual. Look closer, Davis. Any reflections, ripples? I zoomed camera 3 in on the basin. The reflections were still there, clear as day on my monitor. A pause. Negative, Frank. Basin is bone dry. Tiles are clear. Just the normal overheads reflecting. I felt a chill. All right, Davis. Stand by. I'm coming down. I grabbed my flashlight and keycard, leaving the console. The atrium was colder than the security office, the air still and heavy. The only sound was my footsteps echoing on the polished marble. When I reached the fountain court, Davis was standing by the edge of the basin, shining his flashlight into it. See anything, Frank? He asked. On the monitor, yes. Here, no. I looked. The basin was indeed dry. The tiles were clear. The overhead lights reflected crisply, unblurred. Nothing. Yet, on my monitor, which I could still see from my vantage point on the mezzanine before descending, the ripples were undeniable. It was a perfect, impossible contradiction. "All right, Davis," I said. "Let's check the pump room. Maybe a pressure anomaly or a valve stuck open." "But there's no water, Frank." "I know. Let's just check." The pump room was located 2 levels below, accessible via a service tunnel. It was a tight space, smelling faintly of damp concrete and motor oil. The air was usually heavy with the ghost of chlorine, a residue from the treated water. But tonight, as I pushed open the heavy steel door, a different scent hit me. It was sharp, metallic, like an electrical discharge. Ozone, not chlorine. The main pumps were massive, industrial-grade units. All indicator lights were off. All gauges read 0. I checked the manual override panel. No signs of tampering. The main water intake valve was closed, secured with a lockout tag. I ran my hand over the main pump motor. Cold. No vibration. It hadn't been running. Then I looked at the old mechanical timer dial, a backup system that hadn't been used in years. Its brass teeth were rusted, frozen in place at the 11 p.m. shutdown mark. It hadn't moved. Nothing here indicated a system activating, but the ozone smell was strong, almost stinging my nostrils. I remember a time years ago when my youngest, Sarah, had left the iron on in her room, and the smell of hot metal and ozone had filled the house. This was similar, but stronger. As I stood there, scanning the pipes, a low, wet sound echoed from the far end of the room. A gurgle. Distinct. It came from the main drain line, a thick PVC pipe leading out of the room. It gurgled once, a deep, resonant sound, like someone clearing their throat, then stopped. Nothing followed. No rush of water, no continuous flow. Just that single, impossible gurgle. Davis looked at me, his eyes wide. "What was that?" "I don't know," I said, my voice lower than I intended. "But nothing here explains it." We spent another 10 minutes in that room, checking every valve, every pipe. Nothing. I logged the ozone smell and the gurgle. Back in the atrium, the fountain was still dry. Davis confirmed it again. But as I ascended the stairs to the mezzanine, I glanced at camera 3 on my handheld tablet. The ripples were still there, clear as ever. They seemed to be reflecting something, an unseen light source perhaps, but the light was moving, undulating, entirely within the dry basin. It was a perfect illusion of water, without a single molecule of liquid present. I dismissed Davis to continue his rounds. My protocol for unexplained phenomena was to report to my superior, John Carter, and wait for his instructions. But what was I going to tell him? That a dry fountain was showing water on camera but not in person? That the pump room smelled of ozone, not chlorine, and a drain gurgled once for no reason? I knew how that would sound. I returned to my console, pulling up camera 3 again. The reflections continued, a silent, impossible dance on the dry marble. I zoomed in as far as the camera allowed, trying to discern the source, the mechanism. The light seemed to refract within the basin, distorting the marble pattern itself, as if the surface had become a lens. It was a perfect visual lie. I stared at it until my eyes ached, waiting for it to vanish, for the camera to glitch out, for some logical explanation. It never did. The clock on my screen ticked past 3 a.m., then 3:30 a.m., and the dry basin continued to shimmer with phantom water, reflecting nothing but its own impossible movement. My name is Mark Jensen. For the past 15 years, I've run Apex Facilities Solutions, a company specializing in infrastructure mapping, system diagnostics, and optimizing facility layouts for commercial and government clients. Most of our work is mundane: replacing old HVAC systems, rerouting data lines, or like today, updating outdated blueprints. We were contracted by the city to remap the sub-basement delivery tunnels beneath the old municipal building downtown. The original plans were from the 1930s, hand-drawn, and wildly inaccurate. It was a Tuesday, late October. The air in the sub-basement was cool and still, carrying the faint, persistent scent of industrial cleaning solution mixed with stale concrete. My junior tech, David Miller, and I had been at it since 0600. Our objective for the day was the main loading tunnel, a 10-foot wide, 12-foot high concrete passage that snaked from the exterior loading dock to the building's central compactor bay. Standard procedure: establish a baseline, set up grid points every 10 yards, and use the Leica Disto X4 to log distances and angles. We'd then upload the data to our CAD software for a precise 3D model. We started at the loading dock entrance. David held the prism pole steady while I took the initial shots, logging the tunnel's width and height. The concrete floor was smooth, worn slick in places, with a few notable cracks and a distinctive green paint spill near an old fire door about 20 feet in. "All right, David, let's get a run down to the compactor bay," I called out, my voice echoing slightly in the enclosed space. "Keep a straight line. I'll take point." I walked ahead, the laser distance measurer in my hand, aiming its bright red dot at the far end of the tunnel. The compactor bay was visible, a steel-reinforced opening with a large hydraulic press mechanism. The disto beeped, displaying 44.2 yards. "Got it," I murmured, logging the distance to my tablet. "Now let's walk it, verify, and mark our 10-yard intervals." David followed about 10 feet behind me, carrying the marking kit. We moved at a steady pace, the beam of my headlamp cutting through the gloom. I called out, 10 yards, 20 yards, and David would spray a small temporary chalk mark on the floor. I was thinking about my daughter's science fair project on simple machines, a lever demonstration she was struggling with, trying to mentally troubleshoot it while my feet kept moving. The tunnel was perfectly straight, no bends or turns, just a long, unblemished concrete corridor. After what felt like a minute or two of walking, David called out, "Mark, hold up a second." I stopped. "What is it?" "We're back at the fire door," he said, his voice laced with confusion. "And the green paint spill. Didn't we just start here?" I turned, my headlamp beam sweeping across the familiar green blotch on the floor. The heavy steel fire door set into the wall. It was unmistakably our starting point, the one we'd passed just a few minutes ago. My internal clock screamed that we hadn't walked 44 yards. More like 20. But the laser measurer, which I hadn't reset, still displayed a continuously increasing distance. It read 51.8 yards. "That's not right," I said, my brow furrowed. We walked straight. No turns. How could we be back here? I checked my tablet. The last log distance was 44.2 yards to the compactor bay. We had definitely started from this fire door, walking towards the compactor. The compactor bay should be ahead of us, not behind. "Maybe I misread the initial distance," I muttered, shaking my head. It was a long day, and fatigue could lead to small errors. "Let's re-verify. David, you stay here. I'm going to walk back to where I thought the compactor bay was, and you tell me what the laser reads when I get there. I turned around, facing the direction we had just come from. The tunnel stretched out, identical in every direction. I aimed the laser. It still read 52.1 yards. I started walking, aiming for what my memory insisted was the compactor bay. My steps were deliberate, measured. I walked for what felt like the same distance as before. The laser clicked up. 60 yards. 70. Then 80. I stopped, looking at the tunnel ahead. There was no compactor bay, just more tunnel. And behind me, I heard David's voice, sounding strained. "Mark, you're back at the fire door again. The paint spill. You just walked around." I spun around. He was right. The green paint spill. The fire door. The laser measurer in my hand now read 88.4 yards. I had walked back to the fire door from the fire door, without ever seeing the compactor bay or making a turn. The tunnel was a straight line, yet it circled back on itself. "This isn't right," I repeated, the words feeling inadequate. "This isn't geometrically possible." My standard mapping protocol, which relied on Euclidean geometry, was failing. We couldn't plot a straight line that looped. "Let's try something else," I said, my voice tighter now. "David, stand at the fire door. I'm going to walk in what I think is the direction of the compactor bay. You keep the laser aimed at me and tell me the distance as I walk." I started walking, focusing on the distant, identical concrete wall. David's voice crackled over the comms. 10 yards, 20 yards, 30 yards. You're approaching the 40-yard mark, Mark. 44 yards, that's where the compactor bay should be. I kept walking. There was no compactor bay, just the tunnel. "Keep going, David. 50 yards, 60, 70. Then, David's voice, sharp with disbelief. "Mark, you just passed me. You're at the fire door again. The laser reads 88.1 yards. I stopped dead, turning slowly. David was standing by the green paint spill, his headlamp beam fixed on me. I was facing him, having walked past him. Yet he was still at the fire door. And so was I. The tunnel was a continuous, unbroken straight line. Yet it brought me back to my starting point every 44 yards, precisely. The compactor bay, which should have been 44 yards from the fire door, was nowhere to be found. The laser measurer, which had been tracking my distance from the original fire door reference, now showed 88.1 yards. It was counting the distance as if the tunnel was endless, even though I was physically back at the same spot. I tried to log the coordinates. The CAD software kept flagging overlapping geometry and impossible vector. We couldn't map it. We couldn't even describe it. We tried walking in the opposite direction. Same result. Every 44 yards, we were back at the green paint spill by the fire door. The compactor bay remained elusive. A phantom destination always 44 yards ahead, yet never reached. We were in a corridor that was both finite and infinite. A straight line that was a circle. We packed up our gear. There was no point in continuing. We had a tunnel that defied measurement, a section of the building that simply could not exist according to every principle of physical space we knew. My final entry in the field log was brief. Tunnel section from fire door A to compactor bay C unmappable. Repeated straight-line traversal results in return to origin point without directional change. Laser distance measurement continues to accrue. Recommend further investigation with specialized equipment, or reevaluate project scope. I knew further investigation was just code for we have no idea what's going on. The city would get an incomplete blueprint, a section of the sub-basement marked simply as unverified. We left the tunnel, the persistent hum of the building's ventilation system the only sound, leaving behind a space that was, to this day, an impossible paradox.
My name is Mark Jensen, and I've been an HVAC technician for nearly 15 years. Most of my work is commercial: malls, office buildings, data centers. I manage the climate control systems, the air handlers, the chillers, the whole building automation system, or BAS. It's a lot of data, a lot of logic, and usually it's pretty predictable. The system tells you what's happening and you fix it. Simple. This call came in late Tuesday night, around 11:30 p.m. The night security guard at the Northwood Mall, an older guy named Frank, reported a persistent anomaly in the food court's BAS. He said the system kept switching the zone from unoccupied to occupied mode, even though the mall had been locked down since 9 p.m. I pulled into the deserted parking lot, the asphalt still radiating a faint heat from the day, contrasting with the cool, humid night air. The only sound was the distant hum of the main chiller unit on the roof. I signed in with Frank at the security desk. He looked tired, rubbing his eyes. "Glad you're here, Mark. It's been doing it for hours. Lights keep coming on, then off." I nodded, grabbed my laptop, and headed to the maintenance office, a small, windowless room tucked behind the old department store. I booted up my machine and connected to the BAS. The interface glowed, a familiar grid of zones and data points. I navigated to the food court's climate zone, FC01. The trend graph for occupancy sensors was immediately visible. Instead of a flat line indicating unoccupied after closing hours, there were distinct, regular spikes. Every 12 minutes, precisely, the occupancy sensor would trip, registering movement and a heat signature. It would hold for maybe 30 seconds, then drop back to 0. This wasn't a random flicker, it was a pattern. My first thought, a common one, was a faulty sensor. A cheap PIR unit could be failing, sending ghost signals. I made a mental note to check its wiring, maybe replace it if necessary. That was my mistake, my initial overconfidence. I assumed a simple hardware issue. "Okay, Frank," I radioed. "I'm seeing it. Looks like a bad sensor. I'm going to head into the food court and take a look. You need a key for the gate, Mark. I'll meet you there." The food court was a cavernous space, usually bustling with noise and fluorescent light. Now, it was dim, lit only by emergency egress lights and the faint glow from the skylights. The air was cool, almost chilly, with that particular stale scent of old popcorn and cleaning solution. I clicked on my heavy-duty flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom, illuminating rows of empty tables and chairs. It reminded me of my first job, working at the local cinema, sweeping up after the last show, the silence always a little unnerving. I walked toward the center, my boots echoing on the polished concrete. The occupancy sensor for FC01 was mounted high on a column, a small, dome-shaped unit. I pulled out my FLIR camera, a thermal imager, and scanned the area. The tables and chairs registered as cool, a uniform blue-green on the FLIR screen, indicating ambient temperature. Nothing unusual. Then,
As I panned across a cluster of tables near the closed pretzel stand, I saw it. On the seat of a red plastic chair, a distinct, faint, orange outline. It was diffuse, like the residual heat from a body that had just stood up. The shape was unmistakably human, a lingering impression of warmth. My breath caught. I lowered the FLIR for a second, just to verify with my naked eye that the chair was empty. It was. When I raised the FLIR again, the orange outline was gone. The chair was uniformly cool, like all the others. I stood there, flashlight beam steady, heart thumping a little harder. My mind tried to rationalize it. A reflection? A draft? But the thermal camera doesn't lie about heat signatures. And the outline was too specific, too perfectly shaped.
As I was still processing this, a low rumble started, growing quickly into a powerful rush of air. The noise came from the ceiling vents above. The main air handler for the food court zone, AHUFC-01, had just kicked into full day mode operation. The BAS had registered occupancy, and without any schedule override from me or Frank, it was now pumping conditioned air, raising the temperature set point from 68 degrees to 72, and increasing ventilation rates. The system was reacting as if the food court was fully active, ready for lunch rush. "Mark, you all right in there?" Frank's voice crackled over my radio. "Yeah, Frank, the air handler just kicked on, full blast." "Told you, it's been doing that all night. Thought it was just a glitch." I walked back to the maintenance office, my mind racing. A faulty sensor wouldn't trigger the entire air handler system to switch to occupied mode. The BAS logic requires a confirmed, persistent occupancy signal before it ramps up the AHU. This wasn't a simple sensor malfunction. The system was seeing something. I sat back down at the terminal, pulling up the detailed logs for FC01. I cross-referenced the occupancy spikes with the AHU operational data. Every single time the occupancy sensor tripped, exactly 12 minutes apart, the AHU would begin its ramp-up sequence, then cycle back down when the sensor dropped. This was not a random event. This was a direct, logical response from the BAS to a perceived presence. I pulled up the sensor diagnostics. All readings were within nominal parameters. No error codes, no voltage drops, no signal degradation. The sensor was reporting exactly what it was detecting. My protocol for persistent phantom occupancy is usually to isolate the sensor, test its voltage, then replace it. But replacing it wouldn't solve anything here. The sensor wasn't broken. It was reporting data that the system was interpreting as genuine. The thermal ghost, the precise timing, the system's full response. It all pointed to something beyond a simple electrical fault. My standard troubleshooting procedure was useless because the system was working too well. I sat there, staring at the glowing screen, the green lines spiking every 12 minutes. The BAS was telling me, unequivocally, that someone, or something, was moving through the food court, sitting down, then standing up, every 12 minutes, all night long. And, whatever it was, it left a thermal footprint that vanished when I looked away. The system was reacting to a presence that my own eyes, even with a thermal imager, couldn't confirm in real time. The data was there, undeniable, but the subject was not. I had no explanation, only a perfectly functioning system reporting an impossible truth. My name is Robert Miller, and for the past 15 years I've worked as a municipal code inspector for the city. My specialty is vertical transport systems, elevators, escalators, moving walkways. I've seen everything from ancient, rope-driven freight lifts to the latest high-speed express units in glass towers. My job is to ensure these machines are safe,
compliant with city codes, and operating as intended. It's mostly routine, checking logs, measuring tolerances, testing emergency stops. But sometimes, you see things that don't fit the manual. This particular call was a final inspection at the newly renovated Civic Center atrium. A brand new escalator, still gleaming under the skylights. Model, KONE Eco 3000, standard commercial unit. 48-inch steps, 30-degree incline. The installation crew had finished their work, and now it was my turn to sign off before the public opening. I started at the upper landing, checking the handrail entry points, brush guards, and comb plates. Everything looked clean, well aligned. I engaged the service key, powered it up, and let it run for 10 minutes, observing its operation. The steps moved smoothly, the handrails tracked correctly. No unusual noises from the drive unit below. I pulled out my tachometer to measure the handrail speed against the step speed. It was off by a hair, maybe 1.5% too fast. Not a major safety hazard, but enough to warrant a tag out for adjustment. "Okay, boys," I called out to the remaining crew packing up their tools. "Handrail's a little hot. I'm tagging it out for adjustment." They nodded, accustomed to my nitpicking. My procedure is strict. Once a system is tagged out, it's completely isolated. I walked to the control cabinet located in a small utility room adjacent to the upper landing. I opened the panel, confirmed the main breaker was tripped, and then engaged the mechanical lockout. This involved a heavy-duty steel bar that physically blocked the breaker switch from being re-engaged, and then I secured it with my personal padlock. A bright red "Do Not Operate" tag, signed and dated, hung prominently from the lockout device. With the drive motor completely disconnected from power, the escalator was inert. The steps were static, the chain locked. That's the protocol. That's how it works. I went back to the escalator for a final sweep, a habit I picked up early in my career. You never know what a crew might leave behind. A stray bolt, a dropped tool. I started at the top, walking down the steps, scanning for debris. The atrium was quiet. Only the distant hum of the building's HVAC system and the occasional clang from the departing crew. As I reached the halfway point, I noticed something. A subtle shift. The step beneath my foot felt like it was moving. I stopped, planting my feet firmly. My gaze fixed on the edge of the step ahead of me, where it met the stationary comb plate. It was definitely moving. Slowly. Backward. Uphill. My first thought was that I was tired, maybe an optical illusion from the polished chrome. I'd been on inspection since 6 a.m. I shook my head, focused. The gap between the steps and the comb plate was widening, inch by agonizing inch. This was impossible. The drive was locked out. The motor had no power. The chain was static. I walked back up to the control cabinet, my heart starting to thump. The red tag was still there, my padlock secure. The lockout bar was firmly in place. The main breaker was visibly tripped. No power was getting to that motor. I returned to the escalator. The steps were still creeping backward, maybe an inch every second. It was silent. No grinding, no mechanical strain. Just a slow, relentless retreat. I reached into my kit and pulled out a 12-inch adjustable wrench, a heavy steel tool. I placed it flat on a step about 5 feet from the upper landing. I watched it. The wrench began to move. It traveled uphill, carried by the slowly retreating steps, until it reached the upper comb plate. For a moment it teetered on the edge, then dropped into the dark maw of the escalator pit. The sound of it hitting the bottom was a dull thud, muffled by the machinery. This wasn't an illusion. This was real. My professional protocol dictates that I never enter a service pit if there's any chance of movement. But this wasn't powered movement. This was something else. I had to see the drive chain. I had to understand how this was happening. I called out to the last crew member I saw, a young guy named David, but he was already out the door. The atrium was empty. I got the access key for the pit hatch, unlocked it, and descended the ladder. The pit was cool, smelling faintly of stale machine oil and dust. I shone my flashlight around. The main drive motor was there, covered in its protective casing. The drive chain, a massive loop of steel, was clearly visible. It was perfectly still. The sprockets were stationary. There was no tension, no sign of slippage, nothing. I checked the brake assembly. It was fully disengaged, as it should be when the power is off. For a split second, I wondered if I'd forgotten to disengage it earlier. A fleeting moment of self-doubt. But I knew I hadn't. My lockout procedure is rote. I could do it in my sleep. I looked up, through the gap where the steps disappeared. I could still see the underside of the steps, slowly, silently moving backward. The individual step rollers were turning, but the main drive chain was absolutely frozen. It was like the steps themselves were generating their own motion, defying the very physics of the machine. I tried to think. Could a counterweight system be somehow engaged? No, escalators don't work like that. Could residual tension in the chain be slowly unwinding? Not at this speed. Not this consistently. And not without the chain itself moving. I pulled out my phone to record. I filmed the stationary drive chain, then panned up to the moving steps, trying to capture the impossible contradiction. The light was poor in the pit, and my hands were shaking slightly. I knew I needed to stop it. I grabbed a thick wooden block I kept in my kit for wedging doors. I tried to force it between a roller and the frame, hoping to jam the steps. The wood splintered, groaned, and then was slowly, inexorably ground down by the relentless, silent, backward creep. It just kept moving. I climbed out of the pit, my mind racing. I needed to call my supervisor, Mr. Davies. I had to explain this. As I emerged into the atrium, I saw Maria, one of the evening janitorial staff, pushing her cart across the polished floor. She was heading towards the escalator, perhaps to use the adjacent exit. "Maria, wait!" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. "Stay clear. It's out of service." She looked at me, a quizzical expression on her face, then glanced at the escalator. She didn't pause, didn't seem to notice anything amiss. She just gave a polite, confused smile and continued past to another exit. She hadn't seen it. Or perhaps she hadn't seen the movement. But the wrench was gone, dropped into the pit. I pulled out my phone again. I took more photos, a short video clip of the lockout tag, then a pan to the steps. They were still moving. I measured the rate again with a stopwatch and a ruler I carried in my pocket. It was still exactly 1 inch per second. I secured the area with additional caution tape, triple-checking every entry point. I left the site feeling an unease I hadn't experienced in years. The next morning, I returned with Mr. Chen, a senior mechanical engineer from the city's facilities department. The atrium was brighter, the air still.
The escalator was completely still, motionless. We descended into the pit. My wrench was there, lying on the concrete floor, exactly where it would have fallen. Mr. Chen examined the drive, the chain, the brake. He found nothing. No loose components, no evidence of tampering, no mechanical fault. He checked the control cabinet. My lockout was still in place. I showed him my photos and video. The lockout tag was clear. The stationary drive was clear. But the video of the steps moving? It was blurry, a slight shimmer that could have been a trick of the light, or my shaky hand, or just poor resolution. It wasn't definitive. It wasn't proof. He nodded, but his expression was unreadable. "It looks like a standard lockout, Robert," he said, his voice calm. "Everything appears to be in order now." He signed off on the inspection, noting my initial handrail adjustment request. The escalator was cleared for public use later that week. I never filed a formal report about the backward movement. How could I? It defied every principle I knew. There was no protocol for an escalator that moves without power, without its drive chain, without any discernible cause. It just moved. And then it stopped. And I still don't know why. I'm David Miller, head of maintenance for the Westwood Mall. Been in the trade for 25 years, 15 of those here. You learn the rhythm of a building, the way it breathes, the sounds it makes under stress. Most of the time, stress means a clogged toilet or a tripped breaker. Sometimes, it's a storm. This particular Tuesday, the storm had been building since mid-morning. By 16:30, the rain was coming down in sheets, wind whipping through the service alleys. My crew was already stretched thin with roof leaks and a power flicker in the food court. I was doing a final sweep of the exterior perimeter, focusing on critical points like the main delivery dock. It's a low-lying area, prone to pooling, and the large steel delivery door there is our primary defense against hydrostatic pressure. The protocol is clear. During heavy rain, check the sump pit in the dock well every hour. Ensure the 2 submersible pumps are cycling correctly, and that the well stays clear. The door itself is a heavy-gauge steel roll-down, sealed tight, designed to withstand a significant waterhead. It also has an integrated pressure sensor, tied directly into our building management system, or BMS. That sensor is supposed to give us an early warning if water starts to build up against the door, even before it's visible from our side. I pulled the utility cart up to the dock entrance, parking it under the meager overhang. The air smelled thick with ozone and wet concrete. A gust of wind carried the faint, sweet scent of blooming jasmine from the planter boxes near the main entrance, an odd detail in the midst of the storm's roar. I grabbed my flashlight and the handheld pressure gauge. The rain hammered the corrugated metal roof of the dock bay, a deafening drumbeat. The first thing I noticed was the door. From 20 feet away it looked fine. But as I got closer, the light from my flashlight beam revealed a subtle, convex curve. The heavy steel door, a solid slab of corrugated metal, was bowing inward. Not much, maybe an inch or two at its center, but it was unmistakable. My stomach tightened. This shouldn't be happening. I pulled out my phone. Get a visual,
I muttered to myself, switching to video. Documentation is key for insurance and incident reports. I panned slowly across the door, capturing the slight, unnerving bulge. Then I moved to the dock well itself. My flashlight cut through the gloom. The well, a concrete depression about 8 feet deep, was dry. Completely dry. The grates over the sump pit were visible, the concrete floor below them clean. The 2 sump pumps, a pair of rugged Grundfos units, were silent. They hadn't needed to cycle. There was no standing water, no pooling, nothing that could exert hydrostatic pressure against that door. I checked the BMS readout on my handheld tablet. The pressure sensor on the dock door read 0 psi, a flat 0. I tapped the screen, refreshed the data, still 0. I pulled out my physical pressure gauge, a calibrated Wika unit I trusted more than any digital readout, and pressed its sensor head against the door's surface. It registered a negligible 0.05 psi, barely above ambient. A structural fatigue issue? Maybe. But the door was only 10 years old, rated for far more stress than this. My mind went back to a storm 5 years ago, a real deluge that flooded the main loading bay. Water had been 3 feet deep against the door, and the BMS sensor had screamed 12 psi. We'd deployed sandbags, diverted pumps. It was a proper fight. This was different. This was nothing. I walked closer, placing my palm flat against the cold steel. The curve was more pronounced now, maybe 2 inches. I could feel a subtle, firm resistance against my hand, a faint push. It was like someone was leaning against the other side. But the dock well was empty. I knew it was. I'd just filmed it. Then, I saw the water. A thin, dark line of moisture weeping from the bottom seam of the door, along the threshold. It wasn't much, just a slow ooze. But it was there. And in that weeping water, something else was suspended. Tiny, reddish particles, like fine rust dust. But instead of settling or flowing with the water, they were drifting upward, against the faint, still air of the dock. Like pollen, but defying gravity. I leaned in, my ear close to the steel. The storm outside was a wall of sound, but beneath it, I thought I could hear a faint, almost imperceptible groan, deeper than the wind. The door bowed another fraction of an inch. The rust pollen floated higher. "What the hell?" I muttered, my voice thin. I tried to access the sump pit camera feed through the BMS. The screen flickered, then displayed a no-signal error. I tried to force a manual pump cycle, but the system wouldn't respond. The pumps were silent. The well was dry. Yet the door was bowing, and the water was weeping, and the rust was rising. I backed away, my phone still recording. The pressure reading on my handheld was still negligible. The BMS still reported 0. But the door was now visibly stressed, the metal groaning, the curve unmistakable. It looked like it was about to give. I could feel the push from the other side, a deep, constant pressure, even from 10 feet away. It wasn't a vibration, not a sound I could pinpoint, just a palpable sense of force. The rust pollen, a cloud of impossible red, pulsed gently upward from the seeping threshold. I stood there, soaked, watching the impossible. The door was under immense pressure, yet every sensor, every visual confirmation of the external environment screamed that there was no pressure at all. There was no water. There was nothing. But something was pushing, and the steel was giving way. I called dispatch. "This is David Miller.
I'm at the delivery dock. We have a structural integrity issue with the main door. I need a structural engineer out here, immediately. And I need someone to check the sump pit camera feed. My BMS is showing it offline and the door's under pressure, but the well is dry. My voice was calmer than I felt. I kept the phone recording, the impossible bend of the steel door and the rising rust pollen filling the frame. They logged it as structural anomaly, unknown cause, potential sensor malfunction. But I knew the sensors weren't malfunctioning. Not completely. They just couldn't measure what was really there. I'm Mark Jensen, a low-voltage systems technician. 15 years in the field, mostly commercial buildings. Data networks, security cameras, access control, and master clock synchronization systems. I've seen my share of wiring nightmares, logic failures, and equipment pushed past its prime. But everything usually has an explanation. That's the job, finding the explanation. The call came in mid-October, a week of gray skies and a persistent chill in the air. The Grand Emporium, a shuttered department store downtown, was slated for demolition. My company was contracted to perform a final audit on all low-voltage infrastructure, document what was there, and ensure any hazardous materials or sensitive data were properly handled before the wrecking ball moved in. It was a routine, if somewhat melancholy, assignment. These old anchor stores, once bustling, always felt like mausoleums when empty. I arrived on a Tuesday morning. The main power was off, save for a temporary generator feeding a few work lights and the security system. The building was immense, a labyrinth of departments, stockrooms and offices, all draped in a thick layer of dust. The air was cold, stale, and carried the faint, sweet scent of decay, mixed with old carpet. My first task was to check the master clock system, a critical component for any large commercial enterprise. These systems typically use a central master clock to broadcast a time signal, either wired or wireless, to numerous slave clocks throughout the building, ensuring perfect synchronization. I started my walkthrough in what used to be the employee break room and administrative offices, tucked away in the back of the store on the 3rd floor. This area, often referred to as the anchor back room, was usually a hub for timekeeping devices. The generator hummed distantly, providing just enough light for me to navigate the narrow corridors. I pulled out my flashlight, its beam cutting through the dust motes dancing in the cold air. The first thing I noticed when I stepped into the old break room was the silence. Not just the general quiet of an empty building, but a specific, heavy absence of sound. Then, I saw them. 4 wall clocks, standard 12-inch diameter, plastic frames, all mounted above what used to be a row of lockers. Every single one of them displayed the exact same time, 3:17. And every single one had its second hand sweeping in perfect, synchronized rhythm. This was unusual. With the main power off, the master clock system would have lost its primary feed. While most slave clocks had battery backups, they typically drifted over time without a sync signal. For 4 separate clocks to all be showing 3:17 and still ticking, perfectly synchronized, suggested either an incredibly robust, isolated power source or something else entirely. My standard operating procedure for any clock anomaly was simple. Verify the power source. Check the signal. Then confirm synchronization. Always start with the simplest fix. I approached the first clock. It was a basic, battery-powered unit, designed to receive a wireless time signal from the master. I unlatched the front cover.
The second hand continued its sweep. I reached in, gripped the single AA battery, and pulled it out. The second hand on the clock face stopped instantly, frozen at the 3:17 mark. But the rhythmic tick, tick, tick from the wall unit continued. Distinct, unmistakable. I blinked, then leaned closer. My hand, still holding the battery, felt the cold plastic of the clock casing. The ticking was no longer coming from the clock itself, but from behind it, emanating from the drywall. I tapped the wall. The sound didn't change. It was a steady, mechanical tick, like a miniature clock mechanism buried alive. I figured it was a fluke, maybe some old wiring vibrating, or a loose piece of conduit. I've seen stranger things. I was a bit overconfident, assuming I'd find a simple, logical explanation. I moved to the other 3 clocks. Each one, identical to the first, also displayed 3:17. I removed their batteries, one by one. Each clock stopped. But the persistent ticking from the wall behind the first clock never faltered. It was localized, coming from that specific spot, unwavering. I pulled out my phone. I'd seen acoustic anomalies before, especially in old buildings. Sometimes it's just the way sound travels. I started a voice recording, holding the phone close to the wall where the batteryless clock hung. The ticking was clear, crisp, a perfect metronome. I let it record for about 30 seconds, then played it back. That's when it got weird. The first tick was exactly what I'd heard, a sharp tick. But then, almost imperceptibly, a fraction of a second later, maybe half a beat, there was a second, fainter, tick. It wasn't an echo. It was too precise, too distinct. It was like 2 separate clocks, one slightly out of sync with the other, both ticking from inside the wall. I replayed the recording several times, adjusting the volume, using my headphones. No doubt, 2 ticks. I checked the master clock system logs from my tablet, connected via a temporary network drop. No anomalies, no power fluctuations, no desync events. The system reported all slave clocks as offline due to the building's main power being off, which was expected. There was no record of any phantom signals, no indication of anything other than a dead system. Yet the ticking continued. I needed to see what was behind that wall. The building was old, built in the late 60s, so I knew there'd be conduit runs. I traced the path of the time system wiring from the break room back to a utility closet. Sure enough, an access panel, painted over countless times, was located just around the corner from the break room, directly adjacent to where the ticking originated. I pried it open with my utility knife. Inside, the conduit chase was a dusty mess of bundled wires, power, data, and the thin gauge wires for the time system. I shone my flashlight into the cavity. The ticking was louder now, resonating slightly within the confined space. It felt like it was coming directly from within one of the conduits, or perhaps from the wall cavity itself, deeper than I could see. I remembered my grandfather's old pocket watch, the quiet, steady rhythm on his bedside table as a kid. It was a comforting sound then. This wasn't. My next step, according to protocol, was to isolate the faulty component. But there was no component. There was just a sound. I took out my tone generator, clipped it to the disconnected time system wires leading to the break room. I expected to hear the faint, high-pitched hum of the tone through the wall, confirming the wire path. I engaged the generator. The ticking intensified. It didn't hum. It clicked louder. It was as if the ticking was reacting to my signal, or perhaps the source of the ticking was somehow amplified by the current I was introducing. I quickly disconnected the tone generator. The ticking returned to its previous steady volume. I tried the recording again. This time, the second tick, the faint echo, seemed to have shifted. It wasn't lagging anymore. It was subtly leading the primary tick, a phase shift of milliseconds. It was no longer an echo. It was a separate, independent, and changing rhythm. My multimeter, when pressed against the disconnected wires, showed 0 voltage, 0 current. Dead wires. But the ticking persisted. I couldn't explain it. There was no power, no signal, no physical mechanism I could identify. My professional protocol for isolating a fault had utterly failed, because there was no fault. Just an impossible phenomenon. I logged the anomaly as unexplained acoustic event, source undetermined, knowing it sounded like something out of a bad sci-fi movie. I secured the access panel, put the clocks back on the wall, but left their batteries out. The ticking continued, a phantom metronome in the silence of the abandoned store. The demolition crew would be in next week. They'd tear the walls down. I wondered what they'd find, or more accurately, what they wouldn't. The clock still showed 3:17. My name is Arthur Sims. I've been a night porter for 23 years, mostly at this same commercial complex outside of Dayton. You learn the rhythm of a building, especially when it's just you and the security cameras from midnight to 6. The hum of the HVAC, the distant drone of traffic on I-75, the way the sodium vapor lamps in the parking lot cast long, orange shadows that move with the wind. It's a quiet job, mostly about routine and making sure everything's locked down tight. My shift starts at 11 p.m. First hour is a perimeter check, then a sweep of the main office block, making sure all interior doors are secured. Tonight, like most nights, was uneventful. The air was cool, a faint scent of damp earth from the landscaping. I'd just finished my first pass, logging door statuses on my handheld. It was 12:47 a.m. according to the device, the timestamp I always cross-referenced with my phone and the wall clock in the break room. Redundancy is key when you're the only set of eyes. The parking lot lamps are old, the high-pressure sodium kind. They're wired to a central timer and photocells, but the photocells were all taped over years ago by maintenance because they kept flickering during storms. Now, they just click on at dusk and stay lit until the timer kills them at 5:30 a.m. A steady, unwavering orange glow across the asphalt. That's how it's always been. That's the rule. I was heading back inside, passing lamp standard number 7 near the loading dock, when the first pulse hit. The lamp, a 250-watt bulb I could usually identify by its specific hum, dimmed perceptibly for maybe half a second. Not a flicker, but a step down in brightness, then back up. I stopped. Grid fluctuation? Happens sometimes. I checked my phone. 12:51 a.m. No service interruption, no emergency alerts. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the aging infrastructure. My phone's time, synced to atomic clocks, was always reliable. 10 seconds later, the same lamp pulsed again. This time, it felt deliberate. A distinct dim, then full brightness. I pulled out my phone again, checking the time. 12:51 a.m. Still, I frowned. My internal clock, which is pretty good after 2 decades of graveyard shifts, told me more than 10 seconds had passed. I checked the cash office clock through the window. It read 12:53 a.m.
My phone was 2 minutes behind. That was impossible. My phone syncs every few minutes. I pulled up the clock app, watched the seconds tick. They were moving, but the overall time was off. I tried to force a sync, but it just showed the current time as 12:51 a.m. The cash office clock, a hardwired unit, remained at 12:53 a.m., and my simple quartz wristwatch, a gift from my daughter, was also at 12:53 a.m. My phone was the anomaly. Then the pulses started coming faster. 5 seconds. Lamp number 7, then number 8, then number 9, all along the perimeter of the lot, each one dimming, then brightening, in perfect, rapid succession. Pulse. 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 It was like a wave rolling across the lot. I could hear the faint, high-pitched whine of the ballasts as they adjusted. The air around me felt sharper, almost metallic. I could smell the faint tang of ozone, like after a static discharge, though there was no storm. I needed to check the source. I walked briskly towards lamp standard number 7. The photocell, a small dome on top, was still covered in the grimy black electrical tape I'd seen 100 times. No visible fault. As I stood there, the rhythmic pulsing continued, now at 3-second intervals. Pulse. 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 The light from the lamp felt heavy, almost viscous, and beneath the hum of the ballast, a new sound began to emerge. A faint, steady tick-tock. It wasn't coming from the lamp itself. It was deeper, resonating from somewhere inside the building. A mechanical, deliberate sound. I knew this building like the back of my hand. There was nothing that should be making that sound. My heart rate picked up. This wasn't a power fluctuation. This was something else. I followed the sound. It led me back inside, through the main lobby, past the break room where I'd once taught my old dog Buster to stay by my feet during my lunch break, his snores a comforting rhythm. The tick-tock grew louder as I approached the cash office. The door was locked, as always. I pulled out my keys, my hand shaking slightly, and let myself in. The cash office was a small, windowless room. The air was still and cool. The wall clock, a standard analog unit, read 1:02 a.m. My wristwatch agreed. My phone, in my hand, now read 12:58 a.m. It had lost another 2 minutes. And there it was. On the polished oak desk, next to the stack of deposit slips, sat a mechanical metronome. An old-fashioned wooden pyramid, its brass pendulum swinging with precise, unwavering rhythm. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It was set to 200 beats per minute. Each tick corresponded exactly with a dimming pulse of the outside lamps. I stared at it, my mind struggling to process. This wasn't my metronome. No one in the office owned a metronome. It simply wasn't here when I'd locked up yesterday morning. It shouldn't be here now. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cold brass. The pendulum swung, pushing air. I grabbed the arm, stopping it mid-swing. The tick-tock ceased. Outside, the pulsing of the sodium lamp stopped. The orange glow returned to its steady, unwavering state. Silence, save for the distant hum of the building. I looked at my phone. 12:58 a.m. I looked at the cash office clock. 1:04 a.m. 6 minutes lost. My phone had not just shifted, it had fallen behind. I tried to force a sync again, but it clung stubbornly to its new, incorrect time. It was like the phone's internal clock had been physically slowed, then resumed, but from a different point. I stood there, the metronome in my hand, heavy and inert.
The lamps were normal. The cash office clock was normal. My watch was normal. Only my phone, the device designed for absolute accuracy, was fundamentally broken. I checked the metronome again. No branding, no identifying marks. Just a simple, wooden box. I set it back on the desk. I closed the cash office, locked it, and walked back out into the parking lot. The sodium lamps burned with their usual unflinching intensity. The air was still, quiet. The distant wail of a siren, a police cruiser on the boulevard, Dopplered across the empty space. A mundane sound that only highlighted the impossible silence of the lamps. I knew what I had seen, what I had heard, and what my phone was telling me. But there was no explanation that fit. The metronome was there, then it wasn't supposed to be, and it had controlled the lamps. And my phone, my reliable atomic-synced phone, was still 6 minutes behind the rest of the world. It stayed that way until my shift ended. An unfixable, inexplicable discrepancy. My name is Marcus Thorne, and for the past 15 years, I've made a living documenting forgotten spaces. Hospitals, factories, power plants, residential blocks. If it's abandoned and structurally sound enough to enter, I've probably filmed it. My work isn't just about the aesthetics of decay. It's about capturing the silence, the echoes of lives once lived, and the slow reclamation by dust and rust. I operate alone, relying on a strict set of protocols for safety, navigation, and, most critically, comprehensive audio-visual recording. My Canon R5, rigged with a Rode NTG5 shotgun mic, is my primary eye and ear. Always recording, always listening. This particular site was an old county hospital, shuttered since '08. It was a sprawling 5-story structure, mostly gutted, but with enough intact sections to promise interesting finds. The air inside was thick with the scent of decay, a metallic tang of old blood and rust, and the faint, sweet smell of mold. I'd spent the morning mapping the ground floor, checking for structural weaknesses and marking off areas of interest. My headlamp cut a sharp beam through the gloom, illuminating peeling linoleum and overturned gurneys. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of my boots on debris and the low hum of my camera's internal fan. My core protocol is simple. Every sound, every visual anomaly must be cross-referenced. If I hear something, I film it, and I review the footage on site. It's how I ensure I'm not mistaking a settling beam for a distant voice, or a rat for something larger. As I approached a heavy red-painted fire door leading to what my floor plan indicated was an administrative wing, I heard it. A faint scraping, then a distinct click-clack that sounded like hard soles on tile, coming from beyond the door. I paused, my hand on the cold steel bar. The sound was brief, fading into the ambient silence. I told myself it was just the building settling, or maybe a loose piece of equipment shifting in the draft. I'd been in these places long enough to know that the mind plays tricks. It was a minor misjudgment, a moment of overconfidence in my ability to discern every sound in a dead building. I pushed the bar and the heavy door swung open with a groan of rusty hinges. Beyond lay a long, empty corridor, identical to the one I'd just left, but darker, with fewer windows. The air here was noticeably colder. About 30 feet down, a grimy, full-length mirror, standard issue for hospital corridors, stood propped against the wall. I filmed the corridor, panning slowly, letting the shotgun mic sweep the space. Nothing. Just empty space. Dust motes dancing in the faint light filtering from the distant windows, illuminated by my headlamp beam. It reminded me, absurdly, of my grandmother's kitchen. The way the morning light always caught the flour dust after she'd baked. I continued down the corridor, filming the mirror as I passed it, then proceeded towards a junction marked as the pharmacy row on my map. Later, sitting on an overturned bucket in a relatively clean section of the main lobby, I pulled out my field monitor, a small Atomos Ninja 5, and queued up the segment from the fire door. My own boots, a steady thump-thump, were clear on the audio track. Then, just as I'd opened the fire door, a second rhythm emerged, a lighter, quicker tap-tap, almost a half beat behind mine, like heels. I rewound, played it again. The sound was undeniable. My eyes flicked to the video feed. Nothing. The corridor was empty. I watched myself push the door open, my reflection appearing in the mirror as I walked past it. But behind me, the space was clear. My primary protocol was already failing. The visual record contradicted the audio. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. I re-entered the corridor, my camera rolling again. My senses heightened. The pharmacy wing was just ahead, a row of service windows with faded labels. I walked the same path, trying to replicate my earlier movements, listening for the tap-tap in real time. I heard nothing but the familiar crunch of my boots and the faint whir of my camera. The corridor remained silent, visually empty. I checked the dust on the floor near the mirror. No fresh prints, only my own. The contradiction was jarring. The recorded sound was so clear, so specific, yet the space itself offered no explanation. I reached the junction for the pharmacy row and the description had been specific. The footsteps catching up on the turn by the dead pharmacy. I stopped, my headlamp sweeping the dusty counters and empty shelves. I heard nothing. But the recorded audio played a different story in my head. I pressed on, following the map to what appeared to be a set of public restrooms. The air here grew colder, heavy with the stale scent of disinfectant struggling against decay. I pushed open the men's room door. It was dark, a row of stalls visible only as vague shapes. I filmed the interior, panning slowly from left to right, my mic picking up the drip of a distant faucet. As my lens passed the third stall, a sharp, distinct click echoed from inside, like a latch engaging. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My headlamp beam snapped to the stall. The door was closed. I waited, camera steady. Nothing. No movement. No sound. "Hello?" I called out, my voice flat in the dead air. Silence. I walked to the stall, my hands shaking slightly as I pushed the door open. Empty. Just a grimy toilet bowl and stained tiles. No one. Back outside, sitting in the lobby, I reviewed the restroom footage. The audio track clearly registered the click from the stall. I isolated it, amplified it. It was unmistakable. But the video? The stall door remained motionless, its latch undisturbed. My camera, my trusted eye, showed a closed door that never moved, a latch that never clicked. Yet my microphone, My trusted ear had captured the sound with perfect fidelity. I left the hospital shortly after, the file cards heavy in my pocket. The logical part of my brain, the one that deals in angles and light and verified sound, had no framework for it. A human pursuer? Impossible. The video showed nothing. A structural sound? Too specific, too regular, too much like actual footsteps. I spent days trying to rationalize it, running the audio through filters, trying to find a source, a trick of acoustics, anything. But the tap-tap of heels, the half-beat behind my own, the distinct click of a stall door, remained. I still have the files. I still listen to them sometimes, hoping for a new detail, a different interpretation. But every time, the empty corridor, the motionless stall door, and the undeniable sounds remain in perfect, horrifying contradiction.